Good morning. Thanks for having me. To prove that I'm going to be talking about policy and not science, I'm not going to have any slides. So that you can adjust your eyes. So I am going to talk about trends in federal R&D, and I want to look at trends in the focus, in spending, and in who the players on R&D are likely to be. So the key trend I want to focus most on is that there's a shift in thinking about R&D, and this is both in the administration and the Congress, to worrying more about what the practical consequences are, to trying to assure that R&D is actually leading to results that can actually deal with specific societal concerns. And I'll talk a little bit about what some of those are. Now, this doesn't mean eliminating or even necessarily reducing traditional discovery research. In fact, the funding for that, the proposed funding for that remains strong. It doesn't mean turning to exclusively applied research, and it certainly doesn't mean turning away from openly published research. But what it does mean is having this increased concern about results and looking in particular at two types of research, use-inspired basic research and translational research. So for folks who don't know these terms, although previous speaker just mentioned translational, so use-inspired basic research is a term that was developed in the late 1990s by the political scientist Donald Stokes in a book called Pasteur's Quadrant. And he basically held up Louis Pasteur as a model of a scientist who was looking at making fundamental discoveries in biology, but with specific goals in mind. In Pasteur's case, things like preventing rabies and preventing diseases that were transmitted by drinking milk. And he contrasted this with Einstein, who he saw as an exemplar of exploring the world for its own sake and not necessarily looking at what the results would be. And he also opposed it to applied research, where his model was Thomas Edison, who was, in some ways a glorified tinkerer rather than someone looking to make fundamental discoveries. The point, though, is that this is research that is fundamental, but looking at a particular result, and probably the classic example these days is, or in more recent history, is the work Bell Labs did in the 1940s and 50s to create the integrated circuit, which was probing fundamental aspects of physics enough to win a Nobel Prize, but was designed specifically to find a replacement for the vacuum tube. So it's that kind of model that is where part of the shift is going. The other is translational research, which is somewhat a vague term, but it grows out of particularly the biomedical research area, where there was a view that we were making amazing discoveries, but they weren't translating enough to actually improve health outcomes. And so the notion of translational research is doing research, not necessarily exactly applied research, but steps taking fundamental discoveries and trying to conduct research that will result in actual therapies with them. And the impetus for this, for both the use-inspired and the translational, comes from several places. Several concerns. So one is competitiveness. So the US across the political aisle is increasingly worried that the US may be losing its competitive edge in science, particularly vis-a-vis China. And so part of the impetus for this is to be in a better position to compete by making sure that the research actually has consequences in the marketplace. This concern about competitiveness with China echoes in many ways the kinds of concerns the US had with competing with Japan in the 1980s. But there's a broader consensus, I think, on what to do, or that something needs to be done in terms of China because of the way the economies are intertwined, because of the broader sets of disputes between the US and China, and because of the way technology dominates both the economy and daily life in a way that it didn't in the 1980s. So that's one of the reasons. The focus on competitiveness is one of the reasons for this interest in this shift that I'm talking about. The second is healthcare. The sense is that health research has become by far the dominant part of civilian research in the US. The NIH is by far, the National Institutes of Health is by far the largest civilian funding agency at over $40 billion and the one with the broadest political support. And it has that political support because the notion is that it will result in actual improvements in people's health. There's also been a growth of interest groups built around that health research, particularly interest groups that represent sufferers of particular diseases, and they look for specific cures, not just for research funding the way that traditional research constituencies do. And there's the growing awareness that despite spending more of the GDP on health than most countries, most developed countries in the world, the US health outcomes are not particularly better, at least for society as a whole. And so that's the second arena, is those forces thinking we need to do more to make sure we're actually getting health outcomes out of health research. And the third factor leading to this broad shift is concern about climate change, which has been a growing concern, especially among there's a little bit of a partisan split, but it's certainly among Democrats and independents, both voters and office holders, more and more of a focus on climate, the sense in the scientific community that we're really getting to a do or die period in this. And the Biden administration is really the first presidential administration in US history that has made climate a central focus and has done so right from the get-go and really back to the campaign. And with climate, the concern obviously is not just understanding, but that you need actual technology that will make a difference. So all these factors have led to this interest in moving research, some US research, more in this results-oriented direction. So there are three examples of what I'm talking about that I'll point to. There are more than three, but I will point to three examples in the current federal budget and federal debate that kind of exemplify what I'm talking about. So the first involves the National Science Foundation, the broad agency that funds, underwrites much academic research across pretty much all fields except human biology. And the proposal, and MIT has been very involved in this behind the scenes for the last 3 years, the proposal is to create a new directorate at the National Science Foundation that will be focused specifically on use-inspired and translational research. In the House and the Senate and the administration, they each have slightly different names for this directorate and slightly different notions of how it will work. It was announced just last night that the House and Senate will now be beginning negotiations on coming up with a final version of it. But all the different versions focus on this notion of we want a set of research that kind of models what Bell Labs did, where you're doing basic research, but you have a particular societal goal in mind, whether that's competitiveness or climate change or something else. The proposal for that, to show the level of interest, started at the notion of giving $100 billion to the directorate over 5 years. That was always a little bit of a fantasy. But the numbers in Congress now still look at having such a directorate grow to $3 to $9 billion within 5 years. And the administration's proposed budget has about $500 million in new money for the current fiscal year. The second example is a proposal to create a new health research agency called ARPA-H. This would be modeled on DARPA, which people are probably familiar with, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, widely known in DC as the agency that created the internet. And the notion there is, again, that DARPA is results-oriented, has a different method of choosing proposals, has a different version of creating research teams, and wants results. And so there's a proliferation of proposals to create DARPAs. I sometimes joke that it's lucky there's only 26 letters in the alphabet, because that puts a cap on how many ARPA-8- whatever letter you can get. But these are serious proposals. And so ARPA-H, the idea again is you'd create teams that would be more cross-disciplinary maybe than what the National Institutes of Health does, and that they would be focused on resolving particular problems. That proposal, the administration has suggested $6.5 billion over 3 years. Congress is talking about maybe half that, but still that's creating a brand new agency. Most proposals have it inside NIH. Some people argue it should be outside. But again, this movement to somewhat shift the focus of the research and as a supplement to what NIH is doing, not as a substitute. And then the third place to look is in the energy area. So in the applied, those ARPA-H and NSF would still be more or less basic research. In the applied research programs at the Department of Energy, which are in the part of DOE called Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EERE, the administration proposed a 65% increase, which is unheard of. So unheard of that that probably won't happen, but even the numbers in Congress right now are increasing the ERE budget by a third. So that gives a sense of the direction that people are thinking of going. Now, whether these proposals actually come to fruition will depend not actually on so much on support of the proposals, because the NSF and ARPA-H proposals have pretty broad bipartisan support, and the ERE proposal certainly has strong Democrat support. But this will all be determined by other fights, which you may be reading about. They've been going on for months, on the overall size of spending. So if these big increases in spending, either the president's now down to $1.75 trillion Build Back Better proposal, or more importantly, the regular annual spending bills where the president proposed about a 17% increase in non-military spending. If those top line numbers come down, then these numbers will probably come down as well. But proportionately, these are not likely to go away because there is support for the notions of moving, for the notion of moving in this direction. So what does that mean for who will be the players in conducting research? So first, I think it's pretty likely that there'll be increased interest in industry academia collaboration. If your point is to try to move more quickly to having results and to solving problems that are real world problems with basic research, then combining academia and industry is an obvious way to do that. Again, DARPA is seen as somewhat of the model for both the new NSF directorate and even more directly for ARPA-H. And DARPA frequently funds collaborations between industry and academia. So I think that there will be more impetus for that. That's helpful, I think, to MIT, which has a long history of engaging in such collaborations, and indeed which has a greater percentage of our research funded by industry than most other universities. The second thing I think can be said is, because competitiveness is a concern behind all of these, and especially behind the NSF proposal, that there'll be more scrutiny as to who the industrial partners are. I don't think this will mean that, and especially concerning China, this does not mean that actually no one is proposing having no collaborations between US researchers and Chinese researchers. Certainly no one is proposing cutting off Chinese students coming to the US, and indeed there's lots of proposals to try to increase that flow, proposals that are pending. But I think if one of the goals is competitiveness, then these issues about how you do that, depending on who's collaborating, will come up. Again, this echoes what happened in the 1980s with Japan, which created a whole debate about what's an American company. And the third piece is changes perhaps in collaborations among US universities. So the administration and many in Congress are putting much more emphasis on making sure that a wider range of universities are involved in research, particularly universities that have large minority populations. And in the US, we have historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, that were created specifically for that purpose, but this isn't limited to those schools. And also schools that are not just on the coasts. There's a concern about the current wealth of the US being extraordinarily unevenly distributed, not only in terms of segments of the population, but geographic segments of the country. And so there'll be pressure on places like MIT to find additional partners with schools that haven't necessarily always been traditional partners and that can help resolve these issues about racial and geographic inequity. So where that leaves us, I think, is depending on whether Congress can get past the current stalemates that are both within the Democratic Party and between the Democrats and the Republicans, we could be entering a slightly new era in US research policy, which will obviously be important for universities, even a university like MIT that isn't as reliant on the federal government, gets well more than half our research funds from federal agencies. And this won't be sort of a grand shift the way the US had right after World War II when the government first started funding universities at a broad scale. But I think it will be a meaningful shift, both in terms of a significant new amount of funding going to R&D if this comes to fruition, and again, this shift that I've discussed reflecting these factors. It's always easier to bet in DC that things won't come to fruition than that they will, but I think and that's never been truer, but I think the passage of and signing of the infrastructure bill this week, which was a long and uglier than in the past process, but did in the end create an unprecedentedly large bill on infrastructure, is a sign that these things can actually end up coming to pass. So we'll see over the next few weeks, I think, if that's the case. So thank you, and happy to answer any questions. Okay, oh good, it just got bigger since I didn't bring my glasses. In what areas should the US government do less to better encourage research and technology development? So there's some discussion of this. I'd say in terms of regulation, there's talk about reducing the regulatory burden on universities themselves. That's sort of a constant discussion, but I don't know that there's anything truly about to happen. On the tax side, there's always interest in increasing and continuing the R&D tax credit and other kinds of incentives for industry, both to do its own research and to work more with academia. The problem with the R&D tax credit from a budget point of view is it scores very high. In other words, it looks like it's costing the government a lot of money in foregone revenue. And so what Congress has tended to do is only increase it for a few years at a time because bills are scored over a 10-year period. And if it looks like beyond that 10-year period, if you're getting all the money in that 10-year period, you try to reduce those amounts. And that's made the R&D tax credit more intermittent than would be helpful from a policy point of view. That may be taken care of in the reconciliation bill, but as the numbers are coming down, doing longer-term permanent changes in taxes has been more difficult. But there is continued support for research tax credits. It's just not clear that they can be made long-term enough to really have their full impact. Federal acquisition process, yes. So I have to say, this is not an area of my expertise, but the acquisition process and the federal acquisition rules have been a concern for a long time, and they're particularly concerned because smaller companies that are often the most entrepreneurial don't have the wherewithal to deal with all the bureaucratic complications and requirements. One thing that's happened in a number of these bills is to give these new agencies I'm talking about other transaction authority, which is a way to actually work around all the federal acquisition rules. It might be nice someday to actually change the rules rather than constantly creating workarounds and exceptions. But for now, that's the main method of doing that, and there is awareness of that. Now, obviously on grants, this doesn't come up as much, which is what the focus of NSF and ARPA-H and DARPA is. Both the new NSF directorate and ARPA-H would have the kind of authorities DARPA has to avoid some of the strictures that both on hiring staff and on putting out money that apply to other agencies and other parts of agencies. So there is awareness of this, and again, there are workarounds that are finding their ways into legislation. I don't think anyone has yet had the stomach or wherewithal to do sort of a systemic scrub of the rules, but I think there's great awareness of the problem and efforts to, again, do carve-outs to at least start to address it. Yes, so the Biden administration, core of global partnerships. Yeah, so I think this is absolutely right, and I think it's still a little unclear how this will actually work out in terms of the collaborations, but I think the collaborations will be moving along the areas that I just had talked about in my comments. I think climate and energy are particular areas that people see as, that people in the administration see as potentially productive areas for collaboration, both because they're big immediate problems. All the countries are facing the same issues. It's an area that we want to work with China in many ways, but don't want China to dominate areas like solar or figuring out ways to deal with Chinese near monopoly on rare earth materials and so forth. So I think that's one area, but I think this sense of wanting more international collaboration, it is absolutely a focus, and how that will work out program by program, I think that's still being sorted out. But again, I would expect climate and energy to be a prime example and test ground for that. Yes, so the proposed $50 billion for our semiconductor R&D. So these are great questions, thank you. So in the same package, in the Senate version of the same package of bills that has the new NSF directorate, it's called USICA, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. There is a $54 billion emergency appropriation for semiconductors. So emergency appropriation is a term of art in DC. What it basically means is you don't have to cut money to make this money available. It would just be available. You don't have to worry about the budgetary deficit implications. So this money, $54 billion, would implement a bill that was signed into law last year called the CHIPS Act that would make money available for domestic manufacturing, helping create domestic manufacturing of semiconductors. These could be huge grants, many billions of dollars, but also to have money set aside for increasing research related to semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing. This package that the CHIPS money is in is the one where the House and Senate announced last night that they finally have agreed to begin negotiations on the larger package. There is broad bipartisan support, especially in the Senate, for this money. Senator Cornyn of Texas is the main Republican behind it. And so I think most people think that this money will go through. Well, it's not clear which package it will be part of or the exact timing, but I think the assumption is that this money will pass. In terms of what it will mean for MIT, our folks led by Vladimir Bulovich have been talking to industry, a number of companies, including IBM, about working together, and there's at least $2 billion or so of that money in the 54 that is for research that could end up in universities, not all in one university. But MIT is working hard to figure out how to work with industry to use some of the money that we hope will come available as part of that $54 billion to build up research at MIT to basically help leapfrog semiconductor technologies. And also there's an interest in seeing if some of that money can actually be used to build, to get equipment and infrastructure so that places like MIT are well equipped to train the next generation in the semiconductor industry. Is that it? Great, thank you.